Hello? Awesome. Thank you, guys. I was not expecting this many people to be interested in CSS, I will be honest. So again, my name is Bret Little. I work for a place called Canopy, and we are hiring. We're doing a lot of really awesome stuff. If you're interested in JavaScript 2015, 16, CSS Next, etc., lots of cool stuff, come talk to me. So as well, you can follow along at this address at the bottom here. That's not the right address. Go check out my, my Twitter handle. I just tweeted the right address of the slides. That's the correct one. Not this one right here. Apologize for that. So to start off, I'm going to be covering a lot of things on CSS today, just kind of cruising through pretty quickly. So hopefully at the end I can have some time for questions. But to start off, I'm kind of curious. Could do a little straw poll here from you guys. Who here likes, like really loves CSS? Oh man, he's got both hands in the air. He's like, he's all in on CSS. Okay, all right. So in some of my research and my physics experience of science and research, if I were to rate like, if I were to gather like all back-end technologies that you could code in, like we could talk about Python, Java, maybe even Node.js, you get modules in Node at least, like all the things out there, if you were to rate the crappiness of it onto a crapometer, you might get something like this. Now, if we put front-end code, specifically JavaScript, on the same meter, on average, if I'm just to kind of look at most code I've seen, you know, you get this kind of exponential sort of increase in crappiness. Now, if we were to put CSS on the graph, it starts to get a little worse. And then there's also something called GWT. So how have we, over the past couple years, we've been trying to do various things to make CSS less crappy. Who here is familiar with CSS preprocessors? Like everybody, I hope. CSS, like preprocessors, I'm talking about SASS, I'm talking about less, Stylus. A lot of people are familiar with those. Now, another bit of a straw poll, who likes their preprocessor? Most people. It's decent, it helps out a little bit. I agree. It's some level of evolution of improvement, I feel like, where we're getting some level of improvement on the overall language of CSS. But I think part of the downfall with CSS in general is some of the shortcomings of the language as a whole. I think it's an interesting thing. If you take most programming languages out there, or actually before I mention that, so usually when it comes to CSS, you're considered, you wrote good CSS if it perfectly, pixel perfect matches what the UI guy gave you. Does it match pixel perfect a PSD Photoshop file? That's like our measurement of success when it comes to CSS, which is crazy and ridiculous. Who like rates the quality of their back-end code purely based upon does the JSON API work? Is it according to spec? Is that your only measurement for like quality back-end code? That's absurd. So why is it seems like, at least in the front-end world in CSS, we judge CSS more based upon is it pixel perfect? When in reality, like most languages, we should care about a variety of other things, especially with regards to CSS. Is the code readable? That's obvious. Is it readable? But CSS, really, is your CSS readable? Does your SASS, does your Stylus make it more or less readable? Think about that for a moment. If you're to pull up some of your less files or your SASS files, is it more readable? Is it easier to change or extend? Is your preprocessor helping you be able to change and extend it in the future? Is it really decoupled? Is it easy to take components and compose them together and reuse stuff? Or is it really crappy? And last of all, will it scale? And I'm not talking necessarily like server scale, like thousands of, hundreds of millions of servers for CSS or something. Not that kind of scale. I'm talking about organizational scale. You've got 100 developers all modifying your CSS files. Like, what kind of collisions do you have and what kind of issues do you have in general with your CSS? And these are questions, and the good architectural principles are the things that we follow in any kind of good backend code, any kind of good JavaScript code. And I strongly feel like we need to be addressing these same principles in our CSS and in our style sheets. But how in the world do you do that? And I would, maybe this will be a bit controversial, but I will venture a guess that your average CSS preprocessor is not enabling those factors. Your average CSS preprocessor is optimized for your authoring step, helping you get the CSS written quickly, helping you get it done fast, maybe helping you get it done accurately. But it's not optimized for maintenance. Down the road, who's going to have to take care of this? And recently, there have been a variety of articles, you can go check these out, that really focus on this key subject. Like SASS and LESS are great, but there are some bad parts. There are some dark sides to overall preprocessors. You can go check out these later. So what are the dark sides of of preprocessors in general? There's a variety of issues that I feel like can come up with them, but I'm just going to go over quickly a couple simple ones. Briefly mention extend. You go nuts with extending things. Every time you extend something, you're essentially copying some level of style into one rule location and just copying it over and over again. Unrestrained nesting. This creates very over-specific rules that can have all sorts of nasty side effects later on. When you're authoring it, might be great, might be awesome, but later on when you need to override something, it's really, really, really crappy. Speaking to Dan Sellers yesterday, I'm not sure if Dan's in here, he specifically brought up that CSS has, and I was thinking about it, I agree with him, but CSS has the most complex inheritance structure over any programming language, at least that I know of. When you think about the inheritance structure of CSS, he specifically brings it to a biological inheritance, where each rule that is applied at the bottom of your tree, there is a matrix of rules or traits that all need to be evaluated one by one to determine if that particular rule is dominant. Is it dominant or is it not? And it's insanely complex the bigger your application gets. And nesting can be the root of the evil of that. And so you might be asking me, well, maybe you're just writing really crappy less code. Well, this is true. I might be writing really crappy less code. I have an example. This is not my computer. And, right here, here it is. It's going to be out here somewhere. Stars, that's what it is. So if I come in here and go to, oh, I didn't push the branch. It's all good, never mind. I've got a great example that I will tweet out later of actually a realistic copy of a less file from an application that is out there on the interwebs, and it's great, potentially, might be awesome, but the nesting that is there, maybe you should say, maybe you just don't nest in less, and maybe you shouldn't nest in SASS. The issue, I think, with these preprocessors is that it's just too easy to do the wrong thing. I feel like a framework or a technology should be easy and enable me to do the right thing, rather than encourage me to do the wrong thing. And this leads to a compromise between being terse and brief and future understanding and maintainability. So what does this mean we should use potentially instead? There is something called post-CSS. Who here has heard of post-CSS? Who here uses post-CSS? Most people, you're using it even if you don't even know it, because a lot of people use auto-prefixer. Auto-prefixer is using post-CSS. Post-CSS allows you to do things that you cannot do in SASS and in less, but it's extremely simple conceptually. Really all it is it takes some input CSS, parses it, strings it through some plugins, and outputs some new result CSS. Very, very simple. What do those plugins look like? Very simple, just a function, takes a syntax tree, manipulate your syntax tree, return it out, you're good to go. And there are a ton of plugins out there. Post CSS nested. If you really like nested, you can choose to use nested in your code base. If you really like mixins, you can still use mixins. Auto prefixer. Colorblind. Colorblind will automatically take all of the styles in your application and generate out a colorblind friendly version of it. BEM linter. If you use BEM CSS, do you want to actually lint your BEM rules so actually enforce that BEM is actually used throughout your project? Color guard. This is a problem I encounter often in CSS where you'll have colors that are extremely close to one another but aren't quite the same thing because a developer used a color picker, color drop functionality in Photoshop and got close to the right color but not exactly the right color. And this will give you warnings based upon color similarities that are too close to one another that probably should be the same color in hex or whatever. Generate a style guide. The two that I want to focus on, because all those are great and all, but this is about the future of CSS. So I want to talk about CSS Next and CSS Modules. CSS Next you can start using right now in your application with Webpack, JSPM if you use JSPM, Browserify, any of that stuff. So CSS Next, the way it works in general is it'll take some existing CSS and compile it into a standard that works in browsers currently. So you're taking a new standard that isn't implemented in all browsers and compiling it so you can use it. Very similar to Babel.js. And this gives you CSS4, but really, there is no CSS4. There's CSS2, 2.1, and 3, but after 3, all portions of CSS will be independently released as browsers support them, and it's this spec standardizes them. So there is no CSS4. So I want to talk about a couple of the things that are coming out in CSS, and you can use these right now if you use CSS Next. First being CSS variables. One of the main things that people talk about they need less or SASS for is variables. And my response is, well, the language itself is getting variables. This is implemented in Firefox right now. So rather than using a proprietary language that's not in any standard spec like less, why not use the actual language itself and be able to use that for years to come? So the way this works very simply, you define a context at the root, potentially. That could be imported from another CSS file that might contain a lot of variables and use those variables as you need. It doesn't have to be color, just colors. It can be a variety of things. Custom selectors. These are also coming out. You can define your own selector as you will and the other sort of selections that it will make, and you can use that selector. Custom media queries. This is really nice whenever you're going to be doing something responsive. Rather than having arbitrary breakpoints, you can define your breakpoints semantically for what makes sense for your application, and then you can use them. Color transformations. I loved these in less and in a variety of preprocessor languages. This is coming to the language itself as well. So you can use color transformations directly in your CSS. And again, all this will be pre-processed by CSS Next and output a browser-compatible version right now. But the key difference between a preprocessor and this, though, and I need to emphasize this a lot, because you might think, really, what's the difference between this and less, or this and SASS? Not only is this according to spec, potentially, but just in general, with post-CSS, there are individual modules that you can pick what you use. So independently of less and SASS, popular things can come up, popular plugins, popular libraries. As people start to use them, then we can push the standard forward. Then we can hopefully adopt new things. I mean, that's what happened with JavaScript largely. I think there's around 40% of ECMAScript 6 came from CoffeeScript. So if we can inspire the future standard of CSS to do good things, to do awesome things, that would excite me a lot. Conic gradients. I put this one in here just for fun. Like conic gradients. Like, I don't know. When are you going to use a conic gradient? Well, a pie chart. You can have one div tag and do a sweet pie chart. That's awesome. I don't know. I've implemented many pie charts before, and I never did it in one div tag unless it was maybe a canvas tag that So that's exciting to me. Hex alpha. Hex alpha is awesome. So you can have a hex color code and define alpha at the end of it instead of having RGBA, which is really nice. Again, coming in the standard itself. And so you do 4 characters or you can do 8 characters. Similarly to normal hex, you can do 3 or you can do 6. And notice the last 2 digits and the last 1 digit are still hex code as well, as it would make sense. Any link, a new pseudo selector, any link, where you can just automatically select any link in general. So it's really just syntactic sugar for saying a pseudo selector, link, and visited. So active, visited, those things. Matches. I don't know if you'd actually use this. I'm not sure if I would, but I put it here because it's in the standard coming out. Same with not. I don't know. It could be useful at times, but that's coming out as well. So, who here is familiar with BEM CSS? BEM. Boo? Who said boo? Too long. Maybe it's too long. I don't know. That's good. So the interesting thing about BEM is BEM tries to take all of the cascading out of style sheets, removing the C entirely out of CSS. And why in the world would you do that? As I think about it, the real reason you're trying to remove cascading is because of those complex inheritance rules of the language. So if you are never overriding anything, if you never nest any rules together, you always define a whole new rule, you never have to worry about overriding. That sounds awesome. Potentially, I don't know, kind of awesome. Makes things a little bit simpler. Another nice thing about BEM, at least, is you can take an entire rule definition and you can search for it inside your application and find its use cases. If you are using less or you're using SASS and you are automatically building out these rules in some sort of nesting structure, it makes grepability really difficult inside your project. Whereas if you just use a vanilla CSS rule, it makes it really easy. But something seems fundamentally odd about this. Does this seem odd to anyone? As I think about it, BEM CSS, type coercion, seems very similar to JavaScript globals, where if you could imagine in your JavaScript, well, just in general, JavaScript globals, we follow this weird pattern for a long time where we'll define some global object, we'll namespace it all the way down because we don't want anybody else to collide with our particular code. We do this in JavaScript. And it kind of seems like that up there as well. You're building out this kind of weird-ish namespace, but it's even worse than that. It's more like you're taking every variable that you declare inside your JavaScript. It could be inside a function, it could be inside an if statement, and you're like building out this bizarre long name for that variable name, just so in somebody else's function, somewhere else in the front-end code base, you don't collide with it. And so you like namespace every one of your JavaScript variables just so you don't run into those problems. That seems a little bit weird. I would not code in a language that forced me to do that. So why am I doing it in CSS? In JavaScript, we've solved the global problem through modules. This is ECMAScript 6. Who here uses ECMAScript 6? Yeah, I dislike using anything but it anymore. Like ES5 is so painful. But very simply, you can import another file and do whatever you want. You can export whatever you want from this file, just real modules in the language. So what if we could do this in CSS? If we could actually import what we want and what we care about, and everything remains encapsulated, I'm not throwing things on the global sort of namespace area, like that would be like nirvana. Like that's exciting. Like, would that be possible? Well, there's something called CSS Modules. I'm so excited about this. CSS Modules really provide just that. All right, I'm gonna focus on this slide, a couple parts of this slide, a lot for the next couple minutes. So the first rule that we have there, Actually, both of these rules, the first thing to realize between both of these files, this is two separate files, that class is not globally defined. Just because if this is loaded through CSS modules, I cannot go on to some random element and put class a link on it and get those styles. It is not globally defined anywhere by default in CSS modules. I can, if I want, use a particular syntax to forcibly make it global, but I'm not going to show you that. That's an exercise to the reader. I don't want you making globals. So by default, these are entirely invisible to anything out there. But I can compose them too. Because these are not visible to anyone, I can make a rule and I can compose that rule onto another rule, which will essentially copy in those particular rules inside of this rule. And that's largely what you're kind of doing in JavaScript land. So this is like probably less than Babel stage 0. This is like extremely leading edge. Like this is not there's a standard or a specification for this, but it's not a standard. So for this to really work inside an application, I think you would actually need some changes to the HTML specification itself. So until then, you can use this currently and right now with Webpack, where it will compile those rules down. And you can define how it compiles down, but in this case, it compiles it down to the file name, the rule name, and then a random guaranteed unique hex code. So you cannot intelligently access that in an unsafe way, because every time you rebuild, that code at the end of there will be regenerated. So it's hidden from the world. It's magically hidden. So how do you use that, though? If it's generating these things out, how do you actually use that in your JavaScript code? I'm going to give you guys an example of React, and that is really dark inside there. Yeah. I don't think that helped. So essentially, though, you just import the style sheet that you care about, and the style sheet on it will have each rule name that's inside of it. And each rule name will have a reference to will just be a string of the actual generated class name. So I can take that style and that class name, and I can put it on top of an element that I want, and I can use it. So let me show you an example of this. So if you go to adventurousbait.surge.sh, I implemented just a simple example of material design CSS using CSS modules. So inside here, so I didn't write any of this myself. Let me just show you an example. Components. So if you go to Adventurous Bait, it's amazing, super exciting. Who knew you'd learn something about stars today? Okay, so if I inspect any point of these, and look inside here, let's make that bigger. You'll see right here, it's card -- title -- a random string name. And subsequently throughout this whole thing, all of those are getting imported again because these are React components. And at the very top inside the React component, we're importing in the style sheet and using the actual class name within it. So the fun thing that you can do though here is if I look at this link, and maybe I will show you out here. So this is just the simple repository where this is implemented. We have link CSS, We have navigation, CSS, and we have card CSS and card.js. So this might actually, because some of you might not have been able to read the last one. So this is an example of how we're importing in the styles and the class names. So this is a simple React component called a card that takes some properties, and we're returning out some HTML. So if we import the styles from our card.css file, card.css is right here. It has a couple cards in it, or a couple classes: card, content, titles, actions, and link. And then inside our JavaScript file, we can actually, so as we import styles, we just put onside class name, styles.card, styles.content, styles.title, styles.actions. And there's a couple interesting consequences of doing this, which I really, really like. It totally changes the way, we've started implementing this inside an internal tool application at Canopy, something that's somewhat isolated before we go too crazy on the whole application. But there's a couple interesting sort of consequences of this. Usually when I write CSS, I'm extremely conscious about what I name the things, because I'm extremely concerned about collisions and just how I name stuff, and I want it to be unique to this component and unique to where I'm working. When you're actually using CSS modules, it doesn't matter what you call the things inside here. It's like, what do you call your variables inside your function? You name your variables for what makes sense inside your function. You're not concerned about what other people are naming their variables inside their functions. You name them for contextually what matters to you. And that's how you start writing your CSS. I don't care about what I call the name of my class other than semantically what makes sense. And in this example, we are composing in, we have some common link functionality that I want to get from link CSS, which is used here. And it's also used here. So you can compose in styles from any file that you want, and you can also compose within the same file. This is composing link base. So making all this work is actually relatively simple. You might think that this is like crazy complicated or hard to do. Using Webpack, this is the Webpack config file to make this all happen. So I'm using Babel.js, but also CSS Next Loader, and then the CSS Loader. If any of you are using Webpack already, CSS modules are built into the CSS Loader already. All you have to do is enable it with !modules. And you can define how the rules are named as well. Like I'm just using name, the local rule name, and then a hash for how they're written, and only 5 characters of the hash. But you can also put directory on here. You can do it however you want. So you can start using CSS Next right now. All those sort of rules, variables, custom selectors, hex alpha, all that stuff. You can start using CSS modules right now, and you should also be using Babel.js right now. So that is all I have. Any questions? Yes? I don't think it's necessarily that complicated just when you look at what they're doing. They're generating a unique class name for each class inside your files. That's not relatively that complicated. But then for composing from other files, they're just referencing other stuff and then pulling it in. Like, it's relatively simple. And the actual CSS module spec is really simple and small too. You can just come on here and check it out. It's really not that long. composition, dependencies, usage with preprocessors, etc. It's not very long, pretty simple. Yes?
How would you do imports if you're not working with React?
You could do it on Angular the same way. So we have an Angular project, except it's built with Webpack. And so we'll import our CSS at the top of our directive files. And once you import the CSS at the top of your directive file, you can insert it into a template dynamically.
Not necessarily. You can put it in the scope.
Yeah, you can put it in the scope.
And
Yes.
use NG class.
Yeah, that would work too. We just don't do it that way, but that would work. Yes?
So, Angular and React rendered on client side, does that mean that you have to re-render that preprocessor every time your client gets requests?
No.
Or is that rendered at build time?
It's at build time that this happens. And also, React works really great server-side too, so all of that could be happening with pre-processed server-side code. So, yeah.
Is there support for source maps? Because I know the generated name, if you're looking at your inspector, how do you get back to the original CSS file to see if your changes are going to be debugging?
Good question. Honestly, I have never been that big of a fan of less and SASS's source maps in general. And so I don't even use source maps. The way I debug this is based upon that generated name. So if I pull up, for example, where are we? That is true. So if I pull up this class name right here, I know that it's in a file card called card, and I know that the rule inside there is called actions. And so I can find it immediately. And as long as I don't have 5 file names named card, which is probably a bad idea anyway, just in general, you should be able to find things. But I could have also defined the rule inside the Webpack config to put the directory on the generated file name as well. Instead of name, it could have been directory _ name. And then if you do have card many, many times, then it's still unique and easy to find because the directory is on there as well. So in general, I don't worry about source maps at least, because I don't think they work very well for CSS. Well, that newbie agrees. Anyone else? Awesome. Well, thank you.